Nursing school doesn't make you a physician. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 43 minutes before everything changed. He was standing in the ICU corridor at 6:33 a.m., voice loud enough for the morning shift to hear, speaking to a second-year resident about scope creep and boundaries and the importance of hierarchy. The resident nodded like a dog waiting for approval. Dr. Whitfield smiled, the kind of smile that made junior staff reorganize their lunch schedules. St. Michael's ICU in Portland hums at a frequency most people never notice. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm. The heart monitors beep in staggered intervals, each one a different patient's tempo. For pumps click and hiss. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead with the irritating constancy of insects trapped in glass. The smell is always the same, betadine and antiseptic layered over something metallic, something like copper and fear mixed into the recirculated air. Hannah Clarke moved through this landscape like water finding its way around stone. Quiet. Efficient. Deliberately unremarkable. She had worked the Portland St. Michael's ICU for 18 years, and in that time she had learned the most valuable skill any person could develop in a hospital, the ability to be invisible in plain sight. She charted at Station 3, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of muscle memory that bypassed thought entirely. Vitals recorded. Medication times logged. Notes entered in that flat, professional language that said everything and nothing. A patient in Bay 7 was spiking a fever. She would check it in 6 minutes. A new admit was coming up from post-op. She would have the isolation room prepared. The ventilator alarm in Bay 2 was subtle, most nurses missed it, but Hannah heard it before the third beep and moved toward it without being called. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame marked by careful invisibility. She wore the same grey ones everyone else did. Her badge clipped to the pocket with her name printed small. Her ID photo from 5 years ago showed the same expression it showed now, neutral, composed, the face of someone who had learned long ago that drawing attention was dangerous. When she moved, she favored her left side slightly, a limp so minimal that people attributed it to fatigue rather than injury. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, and when she reached for supplies, the fluorescent light caught the network of white scar tissue that traced up her forearms like a map of a war nobody knew she had walked through. In her locker, wrapped carefully in sterile gauze in the bottom beneath her spare shift change, sat a tarnished military challenge coin. Its surface was worn smooth by 2 decades of handling. She touched it once before every shift, not for luck, but for remembrance, the way other people might press a wedding ring or say a prayer. The metal was cold. It had always been cold. Some things never warmed up, no matter how long you held them. The 7 a.m. alarm from Bay 4 triggered its routine chime. Hannah glanced up. Routine. She returned to charting, her fingers finding the keyboard again, her presence so still that a resident standing 3 feet away didn't register she was there until she said, quietly, "Bedford needs fresh ice." "I'll handle it." The resident nodded and moved on. This was how Hannah worked. Anticipation without ego. Help without visibility. She had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of being the person nobody remembered but everyone needed. At 7:19 a.m., the trauma bay doors exploded open. The sound came first, not the doors themselves, but the collective shift in air pressure that announces violence. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the medication cart. Paramedics moved in rapid synchronization, their voices clipped and professional. Gurney wheels squeaked across tile. Shouting. Not panic. Controlled urgency. The kind of organized chaos that meant someone was badly broken. Training accident. 37-year-old male, Green Beret colonel, blunt force chest trauma, approximately 30 minutes ago. Blood pressure dropped from 140 to 98 in transport. Respiratory compromise. Likely hemothorax. We're running 2 large ball lines. The paramedics wheeled the gurney toward resuscitation bay 1. As they moved, they cut away the colonel's uniform with trauma shears, the fabric falling away to expose raw trauma. His chest was already swelling, discolored. His left arm hung at an angle that meant fractures. Blood had soaked through the makeshift dressing they had applied in the field. Hannah moved toward the supply station without being asked. Crash cart equipment would be needed. 14-gauge angiocath needles. Chest tubes. The kind of supplies that meant a body was about to be opened, that the crisis was beyond the ability of skin to contain. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from years of watching people break and trying to piece them back together. She pulled the drawer open and began laying out the instruments in order of use. That was when she saw it. The paramedics had cut away his left shoulder as they removed his shirt, and as they repositioned him on the resuscitation gurney, the overhead lights caught his bare skin. A birthmark. Crescent-shaped. Slightly raised. Located on the upper left shoulder, exactly where she remembered it from 20 years ago. Hannah's hand froze mid-reach for the next supply. 20 years. She had spent 20 years not thinking about Marja. 20 years not thinking about the rubble. 20 years not thinking about the 8-year-old boy whose shoulder bore that exact mark, a mark she had stared at for those desperate seconds as she shielded his body with her own, feeling the shrapnel meant for him tear into her back and arms instead, her last coherent thought before the explosion swallowed her whole being a simple one: hold. The Colonel's eyes were open, conscious. Scared. The kind of fear that 8-year-olds have when their world is ending. The same eyes. Older now. Exactly the same. For 3 seconds, Hannah's professional mask cracked. Her breathing changed. Her shoulders went rigid. Her eyes locked on that birthmark as if it were the only real thing in the room. 3 seconds of recognition. 3 seconds of a past she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it belonged to someone else. Then the mask reset. Her face went neutral. Her breathing steadied. Her hands moved again, reaching for supplies, her expression returning to the careful blankness of a woman who had spent 18 years perfecting the art of having no history, no past, no connections that could be traced. But her jaw had tightened. Just barely. Just enough that if someone had been looking closely, they would have seen the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Dr. Whitfield arrived in the trauma bay 60 seconds later, his chief of surgery badge already in hand like a credential that could command flesh and bone to obey him. He was tall in the way men often are when they have never had to question their own authority, shoulders back, chin forward, the kind of posture that assumed every room would reorganize itself around him. His scrubs were pristine. His surgical gloves were already on. He had the appearance of someone who had dressed for the role of heroic physician many times before. "I've got this," he said, and the words fell into the trauma bay like someone had turned off a switch. Every resident straightened. The nurses deferred. The paramedic stepped back to give him space. "Colonel, you're in good hands. We're going to get you through this." The Colonel's eyes were glassy with shock and pain, but he managed something that might have been a nod. Dr. Whitfield positioned himself at the head of the gurney. He took charge with the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of hospital politics rather than battlefield medicine. He called out orders. A surgical team assembled. Monitors were attached. Blood was ordered from the bank. The machinery of institutional medicine began its familiar ritual, and Dr. Whitfield stood in the center of it all like a conductor leading an orchestra. Hannah moved to the periphery, doing what Hannah had always done, anticipating needs, providing supplies, remaining unnoticed. She positioned the ice. She verified the blood types. She ensured the surgical lights were angled correctly. She was a ghost in the machine, and that was exactly how she operated. Dr. Whitfield glanced in her direction exactly once, his eyes passing over her without recognition. To him, she was just a nurse. Just another uniform. Just one of the invisible people who made hospitals function while physicians got the credit. He had no idea. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm, and Hannah Clarke watched the pressure gauge climb too high. Dr. Whitfield stood across the trauma bay, barking orders, his voice cutting through the organized chaos of the resuscitation like a saw through bone. The Colonel lay motionless on the stretcher, his chest rising and falling in time with the machine's cadence, but his oxygen saturation wasn't climbing the way it should. 47%. 52%. The numbers crawled upward like they were moving through concrete. Hannah's hands moved without permission from her conscious mind. Muscle memory. Combat muscle memory. She recognized what the blast had done to his lungs. The pattern was unmistakable after 17 similar casualties in Marja. Barotrauma. The high-pressure settings Whitfield had ordered would rupture the remaining viable alveoli, turn functional lung tissue into Swiss cheese. She stepped forward, calm as still water, and adjusted the ventilator dial down. 20 centimeters of water pressure. 12 breaths per minute. The sedated patient's oxygen levels began their climb in earnest. 58. 64. 72. Whitfield's head snapped up. His eyes met hers across the patient's body, and she saw the exact moment recognition hit, not recognition of who she was, but recognition that she had altered his orders. In front of 2 board members observing the trauma response. In front of the entire code team. His jaw tightened, but the patient was stabilizing, so he couldn't say anything. Not yet. Not here. But Hannah saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the filing away of this moment, the promise of retaliation carefully noted. The colonel's vitals steadied. Sinus rhythm. O2 sat climbing into the high 80s. Whitfield turned away and barked orders about transfer to the ICU, his voice carrying the same authority as before, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The board members exchanged glances. The residents exchanged glances. Hannah continued her work, checking the tube placement, adjusting the settings with clinical precision, her face a perfect mask of professional detachment. 3 days later, Thursday morning, the main conference room in the medical education wing filled with 40 physicians and surgical residents, tiered seating rising like an amphitheater. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, maddening drone. Hannah sat in the back row, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, though she had no reason to be there. She knew what this was. She had seen enough institutional politics to recognize a setup when she walked into one. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium, projector remote in hand, his smile perfectly calibrated to appear concerned and educational. Case Study 7, he announced, examines the critical importance of scope of practice and the dangers that emerge when clinical hierarchies are disrupted by well-meaning but inadequately trained personnel. He clicked to the first slide. Vital signs from the colonel's resuscitation. Then a full page of charting notes. Hannah watched him circle her ventilator adjustment in red marker, the line glowing on the screen like an accusation. This adjustment, Whitfield continued, his voice taking on the tone of a disappointed teacher, was made by nursing staff without attending physician approval. The order called for 25 centimeters of water pressure, a standard setting for blast-related injuries in a patient with significant pulmonary trauma. He paused, letting that sink in. What we see here is a nurse who, despite having no formal training in respiratory mechanics or thoracic pathophysiology, decided her clinical judgment superseded the attending physician's protocol. Another click. Another slide. His words began to flow like water eroding stone. We have protocols for a reason. They exist to prevent well-meaning but unqualified personnel from playing medicine. From thinking that exposure to medical knowledge through observation somehow grants them the expertise to override physician orders. Hannah's jaw tightened. Almost imperceptible. The only crack in her composure. The tiniest flexing of muscle along her mandible. She kept her eyes on Whitfield's face, expression neutral as a concrete wall. Nursing is a noble profession, he said, and the words dripped with false sincerity. But nobility does not substitute for training. For credentials. For the years of medical school required to understand the complex interplay of respiratory physiology and critical care medicine. He advanced the slide deck. More charting. More annotations. Had this adjustment been left uncorrected, the patient would have progressed to organ failure, sepsis, and almost certainly death. The fact that this patient survived is due to the team's subsequent interventions, not because of this initial protocol violation. The residents took notes. They always took notes. Hannah watched one of them glance back at her, then quickly away. She maintained her expression. Stone. Granite. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. That afternoon, Hannah passed the fourth-floor vending machines on her way back from charting. Dr. Whitfield stood there with 3 surgical residents, his hand on one of their shoulders in that paternal way that successful doctors cultivated. His voice carried deliberately loud, the kind of volume that existed just at the edge of plausible deniability. He could claim he wasn't trying to be heard, that he was simply speaking naturally, that it wasn't his fault she happened to walk by at that exact moment. "She's what I call a hero-complex nurse," he said, and Hannah heard the quotation marks in his voice. "Probably watches too much Grey's Anatomy, thinks she's ready for her own surgical suite. Can't accept that some roles have boundaries." The residents laughed on cue, the sounds of their amusement traveling down the hallway like secondary wounds. "The problem is, she's not unique. We're seeing more and more of this. Nurses who believe their experience in one department qualifies them to make decisions across the entire spectrum of medicine." Hannah continued walking. Her stride never broke rhythm. Her breathing remained perfectly controlled. She passed them without turning her head, without acknowledgement, without so much as a flicker of awareness, and watched in her peripheral vision as Whitfield's face registered surprise at her refusal to react. No tears. No trembling. No dramatic exit. Just a nurse walking down a hallway, doing her job, untouched by his words. The next morning, she found Whitfield waiting at the nurse's station with a security supervisor, a man named Marcus who had the tired expression of someone who hated these assignments. The ICU had just begun its morning rounds, and Whitfield had timed this perfectly. Maximum visibility. Maximum impact. "Hannah, we need to discuss your pattern of overstepping clinical boundaries," Whitfield said, loudly enough for the entire unit to hear. The monitor beep seemed to fade into background. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. "Either you stay in your lane, or Marcus here will be happy to escort you off hospital property. Are we clear?" Hannah met his eyes with a flat, dead stare that made something flicker across his face. Not fear. Not quite. But recognition, perhaps, that this wasn't going to be easy, that she wasn't going to crumble under pressure, that something about her composure suggested depths he hadn't anticipated. She responded in a voice like stone, each word carefully weighted. "Perfectly clear, Doctor." Whitfield blinked. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was there. The moment where he realized his ammunition wasn't landing the way he expected. He turned away, speaking to Marcus about monitoring the situation and making note of any further incidents, and then he was gone, his shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Hannah continued to the supply closet. The door clicked shut behind her, and suddenly the fluorescent light seemed impossibly bright. The shelves of sterile supplies surrounded her in their neat rows, gauze packs and saline bags and sealed instruments arranged with surgical precision. She leaned against the metal shelving, and her hands finally began to tremble. Not fear. Restraint. The trembling of muscles holding back a force that could destroy everything in this room. She pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her scrub's pocket. Her fingertips traced the worn edges, the faded emblem nearly obliterated by time and salt and sand from 2 decades ago. In Marja, her CO had pressed this coin into her palm after the ambush. After she'd carried 3 wounded Marines out of the kill zone, after she'd held a child she didn't recognize then, together with her own body while rounds punched through the walls. The coin was the only piece of her past she'd kept. The only proof that those years had been real, that she hadn't imagined the screaming, the blood, the small boy's arms around her neck. She turned the coin over and over between her fingers, watching the light catch its tarnished surface. In the supply closet, alone, she allowed herself 3 seconds of something that might have been grief or rage or some unnamed thing that combined both. Then she pressed the coin back into her pocket, straightened her spine, and returned to the ICU. The shifts continued. Hannah moved through the hospital with robotic precision, avoiding Dr. Whitfield entirely, their interactions reduced to necessary charting and hand-off reports delivered in a voice that contained no color, no emotion, no trace of the person who had once pulled a child from rubble in Marja. The colonel stabilized over 72 hours. His vital signs improved. His consciousness began to surface. Whitfield personally coordinated his transfer to Walter Reed for continued recovery, eager to remove this patient whose case had brought unwanted scrutiny to his judgment. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. On hour 76, Hannah was checking the Colonel's vitals when his monitor showed a subtle shift in the ST segment, a barely perceptible change that could have been artifact, that most people would have dismissed. The resident, a young man named Chen, competent but inexperienced, glanced at the screen and turned back to his coffee. Hannah recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it 17 times in Marja. Pericardial effusion progressing to cardiac tamponade. The exact presentation that preceded sudden, catastrophic decompensation. "I need a stat echocardiogram," she said. "It's artifact," the resident replied without looking up. "No. It's not." The resident set down his coffee and turned to face her, his expression carrying the particular irritation of someone who had been interrupted by someone he had just watched get publicly humiliated. "The patient is stable. Vitals are fine. ST changes are common post-trauma. I'm not ordering an echo based on," he paused, searching for the word. "A feeling." Hannah's jaw clenched, but she nodded and walked to the phone. She paged Whitfield 3 times. Over 40 minutes, as the Colonel's blood pressure began its slow decline. 82. 80. 78. His neck veins began to distend, subtle at first, then obvious. Beck's triad developing in real time. Textbook. Unmistakable. Whitfield arrived annoyed, irritated at being paged, his presence radiating the kind of dismissive confidence that came from never having been wrong in his own mind. Hannah provided a concise report. Vital signs. Monitor changes. Clinical progression. Whitfield glanced at the patient, didn't listen to the lungs, didn't examine the neck veins, and announced, "Increase the 4 fluids." He's probably just dehydrated from the injury. The exact wrong intervention for tamponade. Hannah's hands gripped the bed rail hard enough to turn her knuckles white. The metal was cold beneath her palms. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say the words. But protocol demanded that she step back. That she accept the attending physician's order. That she remain in her lane. So she said nothing. She watched. She charted. She waited. 20 minutes later, the Colonel's heart stopped. The Colonel's heart stopped at 2:41 p.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 72 hours after Hannah had adjusted the ventilator that saved his life. The monitor went from normal sinus rhythm to something that looked like someone had dropped a bag of marbles on the screen, wild, chaotic, useless. The overhead speakers crackled, code blue, ICU Bay 4. The same bay where 3 days earlier she'd watched Dr. Whitfield dismiss every clinical concern she'd raised, every warning about fluid accumulation around the heart that the ultrasound had clearly shown. The surgical team moved like water, swift and efficient. Dr. Chen, the cardiac surgeon who actually knew what he was doing, was up from the cafeteria in under 3 minutes. Dr. Whitfield arrived for minutes after that, walking with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong. Hannah was already at the bedside, reading the monitors the way other people read text messages. O2 sat dropping, 89, 85, 78. Pressure in the pericardium building like steam in a closed pot. The fluid that shouldn't be there was compressing the heart, preventing the chambers from filling, starving the brain of oxygen with every passing second. "I need a pericardiocentesis kit," Whitfield announced, his voice carrying that particular timbre of someone performing for an audience even when the audience was dying. Now. Hannah had already pulled it. The sterile packaging crinkled under her hands as she laid it out, the long needle, the catheter, the syringe. She'd watched this procedure performed maybe 400 times across her career. She'd also performed it herself in field hospitals where the only light was a headlamp and the closest backup was a radio call away. Whitfield positioned himself at the bedside, chest entry point marked, and picked up the needle with a grip that made her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His fingers weren't steady. That was the first sign. "Prepare for subcostal approach," he said, still narrating to the room like he was teaching a medical student, not fighting death itself. The needle went in at the wrong angle. Hannah watched, didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as he adjusted, pulled back, repositioned. 20 seconds gone. The Colonel's O2 sat dropped to 72. The monitor showed the pressures rising, pericardial pressure now above 15 millimeters of mercury, crushing the chambers of the heart, preventing diastolic filling. The brain was already suffocating, neurons dying in the darkness of inadequate perfusion. Again, Whitfield muttered, and tried a second time. Another wrong angle. The catheter wouldn't thread. Hannah could see it in the ultrasound image reflected in the monitor beside her, the needle too shallow, the approach too anterior. Whitfield's hands had begun to tremor slightly, almost invisible unless you'd spent 20 years watching people crack under pressure. She had. She'd seen it in the faces of 18-year-old Marines when incoming fire started, in the hands of corpsmen who'd made their first life-or-death decision and discovered their training couldn't quite reach them. 45 seconds had passed. O2 sat at 68. The Colonel's pupils were fixed and dilating, the brain signaling that it was beginning to shut down, that without oxygen it would start eating itself in another 12 seconds. Hannah's breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. But something in her chest tightened the way a snare tightens around an animal's leg. "Get the thoracotomy tray from the OR," Dr. Chen said quietly, a statement not a request. "Push another round of epi. Let's go to open." The crash cart nurse radioed up. The response came back, "Trays in central supply. Runner is tied up in the ICU stairwell with another emergency. For minutes minimum. For minutes." The Colonel had maybe 90 seconds before the damage became permanent. Whitfield was still holding the needle, still trying, and Hannah realized with absolute clarity what was happening. His reputation was built on being the surgeon who could handle anything. That reputation was a house of cards, and it was about to burn. He'd already fumbled this case once, the ventilator adjustment she'd made, the clinical instinct he'd dismissed. The board members he needed for his expansion were going to find out that this was the second time his hesitation had nearly cost a man his life. So he froze. Not dramatically, not with any visible sign of panic. Just a cessation of forward motion, a surgeon holding a needle in a patient's chest, unable to proceed, unable to withdraw, unable to do anything except stand there and watch the disaster unfold in real time. The monitor ticked. O2 sat, 64. The brain damage threshold was approaching like a train you could see coming but couldn't stop. Hannah turned to the surgical tray. She didn't ask permission. Permission was for people following protocol, for people who cared about scope of practice and chain of command and the careful fiction that everyone in the room knew what they were doing. Her hands moved to the scalpel with the same economical precision that had carried her through 17 years of field medicine, through Marja and Sanjin and the black operations the Pentagon had erased from every official record. "Step back," she said. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost every trace of deference. The timid ICU nurse had evaporated. What remained was bone and steel and 20 years of borrowed time finally being called due. Dr. Whitfield turned, his face a map of confusion and rising horror, and she moved him aside with a hand on his shoulder, not rough, not aggressive, just firm. The way you moved an obstacle when lives were counting down. The surgical residents froze, but Dr. Chen only nodded, stepping aside with the efficiency of a man who recognized true competence when he saw it operating in real time. Hannah's blade found the fifth intercostal space like her hands had never forgotten, like muscle memory was just another name for muscle truth. The incision was 3 inches long, smooth, decisive. No hesitation, no second guessing. She'd done this before in tents lit by chemical glow sticks, in the back of a Black Hawk with the rotors screaming overhead. She'd done it on children and adults and people she didn't think would live but who lived anyway, because staying alive was what she'd promised them. The ribs spread under the retractor. The pericardium was thick with clot, dark and viscous, the fluid that had been slowly suffocating the Colonel's heart compressed into a solid weight. Hannah's gloved hand went in and began careful evacuation, not frantic, not desperate, just methodical. The way you worked when you'd already survived the worst the world could offer and decided to live anyway. 40 seconds into the thoracotomy, the clot was clear. 30 seconds into direct cardiac massage, her hand supporting the colonel's heart, feeling it under her palm like a bird that forgot how to fly, the monitor showed organized electrical activity. Coordinated beats. The heart remembered how to work. For minutes from incision to restored sinus rhythm. The room erupted into controlled urgency, Dr. Chen moving in to assess the cardiac repair, calling for closure, the residents scrambling to keep up with orders they should have been giving 20 minutes ago. Hannah stepped back and pulled her gloves off in 2 sharp motions, the latex snapping against her wrists with the sound of finality. Blood covered her forearms like tattoos. Her face was completely blank, her breathing steady, her eyes the color of someone who'd already stared down the absolute worst and decided it didn't get to own her anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when she looked at Dr. Whitfield standing frozen at the periphery of the room, his hands empty, his reputation collapsing in real time, and she realized that the choice she'd just made, the one that saved the colonel's life, was also the choice that made it impossible to disappear ever again. The colonel stabilized within the hour. Oxygen saturation climbing to 94%. Heart rhythm holding steady on the monitor, a miracle printed in green lines across a screen. Hannah removed her gloves methodically, peeling latex from her wrists with surgical precision, 1 finger at a time. The sound of the glove snapping off her hand echoed in the surgical suite like a gunshot in a cathedral. She dropped them into the biohazard bin, washed her hands for 90 seconds under scalding water, and walked back to the ICU without looking at anyone. The charting could wait. She sat at the nursing station and opened the colonel's electronic record with steady fingers, pulling up vitals, medications, post-operative notes. Around her, surgeons were still talking about what they'd witnessed, a 4-minute thoracotomy performed by someone wearing an ICU badge. A nurse. A woman in scrubs who'd moved like she'd done it 1,000 times before. But Hannah's face remained blank as slate, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the mechanical precision of someone completing a task. Just documentation. Just the work. Nothing extraordinary had happened in that operating room. Nothing at all. Dr. Whitfield disappeared into his office at 1:48 p.m. He emerged 11 minutes later flanked by Marcus Brennan, the hospital's chief administrative officer, and 2 other administrators Hannah recognized from board meetings she'd never been invited to attend. Whitfield's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like his molars might crack. His eyes found Hannah across the ICU floor, and she saw something worse than anger in his expression. She saw the calculation of a man who'd just realized his entire strategy had blown apart. He'd been humiliated in front of the surgical teams. His authority had evaporated the moment she'd pushed past him and taken control. And everyone, surgeons, residents, nurses, anesthesiologists, had watched him stand frozen while a suspension-level employee saved the patient he'd abandoned. That was the moment she understood he would burn her completely. The phone call started at 2:15 p.m. Hannah could hear fragments from other nurses' stations, Whitfield's voice on the line with board members, his tone urgent and controlled, painting her actions as reckless endangerment disguised as heroism. Dangerous unauthorized surgery that exposes the hospital to catastrophic liability, she heard him say to someone named Patterson. No credentialing for surgical intervention. Complete scope violation. We need immediate investigation or we're liable for negligence. Each call was surgery of its own, precision cuts designed to sever her from the hospital's protection. By 3:36 p.m., Whitfield had filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Board of Nursing, citing unauthorized medical practice and dangerous scope creep. But that wasn't enough. Power came from other directions too. At 3:51 p.m., he made 2 calls that took him deeper into his own network of favors and connections, one to Jerry Matsumoto, her landlord in the Eastmoreland neighborhood who rented her the quiet ground floor apartment she'd lived in for 6 years without ever having anyone visit. And one to Linda Vasquez at the New Seasons Market on Division Street, the grocery manager who'd written a reference letter when Hannah applied for the nursing position, based on 6 years of knowing her as a quiet customer who bought the same things every week. Whitfield asked the same questions to both of them. What do you really know about Hannah Clarke? Where was she before Portland? Why the gaps in her employment history? What references did she provide when she applied? Do you know anything about her military background? Neither Jerry nor Linda could answer him, because Hannah had made sure of that. When she'd fabricated her civilian life 6 years ago, she'd created a perfectly ordinary resume with a perfectly ordinary history, 2 years at a rural clinic in Eastern Oregon, some community college prerequisites, a clean record and a blank past. Just a woman with a nursing degree and a need to disappear. Just someone starting over. They'd seen that version of her and accepted it without question because the version they'd seen was designed to be invisible. The conference room where it all ended was on the 3rd floor, the wood grain of the table reflecting fluorescent light like water. Marcus Brennan sat across from her with a file folder and a voice recorder positioned between them like a boundary. His tie was charcoal gray. His expression was sympathetic in the way that meant he'd already made his decision. Ms. Clarke, effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation into credentialing fraud and unauthorized medical practice. His words came out measured, professional, the kind of phrasing used by someone who'd rehearsed this exact speech 100 times. Hospital security will escort you out. You're prohibited from patient contact and hospital premises until this matter resolves. Hannah nodded once. She didn't ask for representation. She didn't ask for the details of the investigation. She didn't ask anything at all, because speaking would have required her to engage with a reality that had already collapsed. Her locker was on the ICU floor. She walked past colleagues who whispered behind their hands, past the colonel's room where monitors beat their steady rhythm, past the vending machine where Dr. Whitfield had made his jokes about nurses overstepping. She opened her locker and removed the challenge coin wrapped in old gauze, the only thing she'd kept from a life that was supposed to be erased. The security guard escorting her out was professional about it. Neutral. He didn't look at her face. Powell Boulevard at 3 in the morning was empty in a way that made sound carry, the distant hum of late-night traffic on I-84, rain drumming on the diner's tin roof in patterns that almost made sense if you listened long enough. Hannah sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seating, coffee gone cold in front of her, staring at her hollow-eyed reflection in the dark window glass. She was 42 years old. She'd spent the last 20 years becoming invisible, and she'd managed it perfectly. She'd moved through a decade and a half in the medical field without anyone asking questions. She'd buried the tarnished challenge coin at the bottom of her locker and convinced herself that the woman who'd earned it was actually dead. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, declared killed in action in Marja in 2004, had stayed dead. She'd stayed dead through 6 years at St. Michael's. She'd stayed dead until 3 days ago when she recognized a birthmark and made the choice to save someone instead of protecting her secret. But the thing about resurrection was that it didn't work quietly. It didn't happen in the dark. Once someone had seen what you really were, once someone had watched your hands move with military precision and your mind operate with tactical clarity, the erasure couldn't hold. The Pentagon had spent 2 decades maintaining her death, had given her a new social security number and a new life and a strict order to vanish completely if anything threatened her cover. Now her cover was gone. Dr. Whitfield had opened the file. The hospital was investigating her credentials. Her landlord and grocery manager were being questioned about gaps in her history. The only solution was to finish what Whitfield had started and disappear completely. New city. New name. Another reset in another place where she could be invisible again. Another version of erasure, because that was the only thing she'd ever been good at. She stared at her reflection and wondered which version of herself she should become next. The morning news hit every screen in St. Michael's lobby like a detonation. Navy searching for decorated combat medic missing since 2004, the anchor said, and Hannah's face filled the frame, 20 years younger in dress whites, her jaw set, her eyes the color of storm-dark water. The photo had been classified. Nobody outside JSOC and the Pentagon knew it existed. The broadcast showed hospital staff stopping mid-stride, phones raising, the ticker crawling across the bottom with words like presumed KIA and Operation Phantom Veil and classified black operation. Hannah stood at the medication cart on the 3rd floor, hand steady, charting vitals like the world hadn't just inverted itself, and she didn't need to watch the screens to know that everything invisible was about to become very, very visible. Downstairs, the lobby erupted into controlled chaos. Security guards clustered around the information desk. 3 news vans were already pulling into the circular drive. And then the elevator doors on the east wing opened, and Colonel James Reston walked out still wearing his hospital gown, still tethered to a portable four-pole, his bare feet slapping the tile in a rhythm like a countdown. The crowd parted instinctively. He was 4 days post-op, his chest wrapped in surgical gauze, and he moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a man who had been trained to operate while dying. He stood at attention in the center of the lobby. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He opened his mouth and spoke a single word with the weight of ceremony behind it, Valkyrie. The room went dead silent. A security guard, veteran insignia visible on his jacket, Fallujah era, snapped to rigid attention. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Clarke," he said, his voice steady and certain. 3 Navy Crosses. SEAL Team 3 Combat Medic. His hand came to his chest in salute, and within seconds, 6 other veterans in the lobby, maintenance staff, orderlies, a chaplain, mirrored the gesture. Shoes on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of respect made audible. Then the front doors opened to a wall of March wind, and a 2-star general in dress blue strode through them like he owned the building. Brigadier General Marcus Sanderson, Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare, reading from a tablet with the precise cadence of someone accustomed to being the final word in a room. "Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby. "Silver Star for tactical medical intervention under sustained enemy fire. Bronze Star with Valor for evacuation of wounded under direct fire. Purple Heart with 3 clusters." He paused, and the weight of each word pressed down like a physical force. "Credited with 73 lives saved under fire in Marja, Helm and Province, before her unit was declared KIA to protect classified operations. You've been presumed lost for 20 years. The Pentagon has been wrong." Hannah appeared in the stairwell entrance, and the general's eyes found her immediately. He nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement from one warrior to another, and she descended the stairs with the same composure she'd carried through cardiac resuscitations and humiliations and the slow erasure of everything she'd been. The crowd didn't part this time, they contracted toward her, drawn like gravity had reversed. Colonel Reston's voice cracked when he spoke. "I was 8 years old in Fallujah, in a field hospital that was taking fire. My father was already gone, KIA 3 weeks before. This woman," he pointed at Hannah, and his hand trembled with something that wasn't weakness but recognition, "was a combat medic. When the airstrike hit, when the shrapnel came through the walls, she didn't take cover. She covered me with her body. She took metal meant for me. Took all of it. And then she carried me 5 kilometers through hostile territory to an extraction point." His eyes were wet now, and he didn't bother wiping them. "She saved my life twice. Once in Marja. And 3 days ago, in this hospital, when she performed that thoracotomy, she saved it again." Dr. Whitfield froze. "She didn't. She was the only one in that OR who remembered how to save someone who was already gone." The room erupted, not chaos, but something closer to reverence. Hands came to chests. People were calling her name now, Hannah, Hannah, calling it like a prayer, like testimony. A nurse from the surgical ICU stepped forward and pressed her forehead against Hannah's in a gesture that needed no words. Security cameras captured it all, the recognition, the gratitude, the moment when the invisible person was finally, impossibly, seen. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield. Not even close. While the Pentagon's legal team was conducting interviews in Portland, while General Sanderson was publicly praising the woman Whitfield had tried to destroy, the Navy's Office of Medical Examinations was quietly reviewing St. Michael's surgical records. They didn't announce it. They didn't leak it. They just started asking questions about case logs, about success rates, about who actually performed which procedures. Within 48 hours, anomalies emerged like bones surfacing from sand. Procedures attributed to Dr. Whitfield that surgical residents documented he didn't perform. Complication rates that didn't match his published success data. Charts amended retroactively, dates changed, outcomes rewritten. 3 former surgical nurses, protected now by federal whistleblower status, came forward with documented complaints filed 3 years ago, complaints about Whitfield's technique, his recklessness, his habit of operating while fatigued. The hospital administration had buried every single one because Whitfield brought in donor money. The same board members he'd called to destroy Hannah's credentials now moved swiftly to distance themselves. One sent a letter requesting his immediate resignation to avoid further institutional embarrassment. Another simply stopped answering his calls. The news coverage went national. Local Portland stations ran segments, "Decorated War Hero Fired for Saving Green Beret," and then cable picked it up, and the colonel appeared on camera from his hospital bed with his chest bandaged and his voice steady. "The woman who saved my life twice was punished for it by a doctor whose ego mattered more than my survival." 6 days after Hannah's identity was revealed, Dr. Whitfield was terminated for falsification of medical records. The Oregon Medical Board opened a formal review into his license. His wife filed for divorce, taking their 2 daughters to Seattle. His reputation, 23 years of careful cultivation, evaporated in 72 hours of news cycles and social media exposure that made him radioactive. Hannah received a formal apology from St. Michael's CEO. An offer of full reinstatement with back pay. A request to serve as clinical director of emergency medical services. She accepted only the reinstatement, declining the promotion with 2 sentences, "I prefer patient care to politics. I'm a nurse. That's enough." The Navy offered to restore her to active duty with full rank and benefits. She declined that too, telling General Sanderson, "I've done my service. These patients are my mission now." 6 months passed. Hannah worked her regular ICU shifts. Her real credentials were displayed now, no longer hidden, no longer deniable. The break room had a shadow box with her decorations, contributed to by staff who understood what those medals meant: lives saved, risks taken, a debt to something larger than herself. The tarnished challenge coin sat in a frame beside a photograph of 8-year-old James Reston holding her hand in a field hospital in Marja, her younger face obscured by the camera angle, but her hand visible, steady, capable, already belonging to someone who knew what it meant to carry the unbearable. On a cold Tuesday in March, Hannah walked past a strip mall on 82nd Avenue. She'd been picking up supplies for the ICU's community outreach program, the one she'd started 3 months ago, the one that made sure no vulnerable person fell through the cracks the way she had. Between a tax preparation service and a vacant storefront, a folding table had been set up. Behind it sat a man in a wrinkled polo shirt selling supplemental insurance. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His face carried 20 extra pounds. The banner behind him read Healthbridge Insurance Solutions. It was Dr. Whitfield. He looked up from his phone by reflex, ready to offer a brochure to anyone who passed within arm's reach. Their eyes met. Recognition hit him like voltage, his mouth opened and closed, and his gaze dropped immediately to the insurance pamphlets in front of him. He couldn't hold her stare. Wouldn't. His hand trembled as he pretended to shuffle papers, and when she paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting him experience the full weight of his visibility, his jaw tightened. Hannah continued walking without breaking stride, without speaking, without acknowledgement. Her limp was barely noticeable now, months of physical therapy had restored her mobility almost completely. She didn't need to say anything. His presence at that folding table was every word that mattered. The hiss of traffic on 82nd Avenue filled the silence, rain threatening from the west, and she moved through both without hesitation. Back at St. Michael's 3 hours later, Colonel Reston was visiting again. He'd come back 4 times in the 6 months since his discharge, volunteering with the veteran peer support program Hannah had helped establish. He wore his dress uniform today, recruitment event downtown, and he found her in the ICU during a rare quiet moment, and asked her the question he'd asked twice before: "Why didn't you ever come forward? Why hide for 20 years?" Hannah walked him to her office. The office that had been empty for 8 years and was now hers, decorated only with the essentials. She touched the challenge coin in its frame, her fingers tracing the worn surface through the glass. It took her a moment to answer, but when she did, her voice carried the clarity of someone who had finally made peace with what she couldn't say. Because I was ordered to. Because the mission mattered more than recognition. Because some operations stay buried so others can stay safe. She turned to face him, and for the first time in 2 decades, her expression showed not the neutral mask but something alive underneath it, something that had endured and survived and was no longer ashamed of either. But I learned something these last months. Power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. I had that power in Marja, in this ICU, and at that folding table where I chose to keep walking. That's all it ever was. That's all it needs to be. Reston nodded slowly, understanding passing between them, the debt repaid, the circle closed, the ghost finally allowed to be human. Hannah's pager buzzed with a trauma alert, and she was already moving toward the stairs, her hand steady, her purpose clear, no longer hiding but no longer needing the spotlight either. Just a nurse who happened to be a warrior, saving lives one shift at a time, the challenge coin watching over her from its frame, proof that some debts take decades to repay, and that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.